So now when we see the interaction of humans with the biosphere and what's happening with vegetation around the planet, um, if we reduce the amount of vegetation, we're going to have less carbon stored in the biosphere. And the main place where we're seeing changes in the amount of vegetation are in the tropical regions through what we call deforestation. And this generates actually more carbon dioxide, which remains in the atmosphere. In addition to chopping down the forests, we're actually burning them. So when you burn the forest or you burn organic matter, again, you take the carbon with the oxygen, you put it together, and you release carbon dioxide, like we see in the, in the image below. But if we regrow this vegetation, the same type of vegetation, it can actually take up this carbon dioxide again. And so people talk about using vegetation as a source of fuel for biofuels. And it's possible to use vegetation as a source of fuel or energy in the future, biofuels, on the condition that when we take vegetation, whether it's from the ocean, seaweed, or from the land, sugarcane or wood, and we use this to generate energy, we have to grow that same amount of vegetation again, so that that will take up the carbon dioxide again when it's growing. And we can see, for example, on the right here, an example of if we have 3 different blocks of trees that we want to harvest. The first one, as the trees are growing, they'll take up more carbon, store more carbon, and so we see this increase in the carbon as a function of time. We chop down the trees, all of a sudden we're reducing the amount of carbon which is stored. We let the trees regrow maybe for 10, 20 years and then cut them down again. Every 10, 20 years we may cut down the trees and use them, whether it's for building or for energy. And a second block of trees we will cut down with a lag of maybe 5 years, and the third block another lag of 5 years. But we regrow them each time. And then if we look at the overall carbon storage in the surface, we see that at the bottom it's more or less constant. We have a kind of equilibrium. So we can use the biosphere for sources of energy or for other needs as long as we grow it back and we have a kind of a steady state of growing and harvesting, growing and harvesting. Unfortunately, what's happening on a global scale is we're harvesting much more than we're growing, and therefore we are taking out this carbon storage out of the system, and in fact this is resulting in an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if we look at the countries which are really responsible for this, we can see from 1990 to 2021 that Brazil, Indonesia, Congo, China as well, many of the tropical countries are contributing a huge amount to this land use change, where we're changing forests to agriculture or to cities, and therefore that carbon which was stored inside the forests is now being released into the atmosphere. And hence, even though some of these countries may not be the most industrial countries, they're not really burning so much fossil fuel. By changing their forests and their natural vegetation to agriculture or to other sources, other cities or infrastructures, they're actually adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So this land use change has occurred again for hundreds of years, and for the Americans and for the Europeans, maybe they feel happy that people weren't around to monitor it many years ago. But if we look at this plot, which is maybe a little bit confusing and noisy, we can see that the United States, if we go back 100 years or so, most of the damage to the biosphere and land use change was actually the United States and in Europe. And in fact, the Americas have lost most of their forests. They have a few in some national parks, but the natural vegetation has disappeared in the Americas and in Europe, in many parts of Europe. But today we see that it's happening in Brazil mainly, but also in China. And we now have satellites which are observing this, so people are noticing this, that it's happening more and more. But we've been seeing the changes in land use around the planet for the last 100, 200 years. At the moment, we're seeing most of it happening in Latin America, South America, in the Amazon, in many of the tropical regions, including Indonesia and in Africa. And if we look at the bottom plot, we can see that if we go back 100 years, say to the 1920s, most of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was because of this land use change, and less so from the use of fossil fuels. Today, the grey part of this plot, we see a dramatic increase in the use of fossil fuels for energy, for running our economies, and therefore up to maybe 80% of the emissions of carbon dioxide are from fossil fuels. But we still see the green area on the plot here in the present day. This is still about 20 to 40% of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is because of these land use changes, changing the natural vegetation to agriculture or built up regions, and reducing the storage of carbon at the surface. And if we look at the numbers here of the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, there's a lot of numbers here, but the big circles are the reservoirs of carbon, both under the ground in fossil fuels, in the permafrost. But if we look in the top, what's going into the atmosphere, first of all, the accumulation in the atmosphere, here we can see is about 5.5 gigatons every year. That's how much we're adding to the atmosphere every year. And this is because of the balance of what we're putting into the atmosphere. We can see from fossil fuels, this is around about 10 of these units. And here, related to the lecture today, is another 2 units, 1.8, is because we're changing the land use, we're changing the natural vegetation to agriculture or to cities, to infrastructures, putting more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But we're actually very lucky because in some areas we're growing more vegetation, and so there's an uptake of about 3 of these units by vegetation in other parts of the world. But also the oceans are taking up about 2.6 of these units, and so there's a balance between what's going up and what's coming out, but we're putting into the atmosphere a lot more than's been taken out, and therefore we're left with an increase of 5.4 of these units every year. And that's what we've been seeing in this plot. You can see on the right-hand corner the Keeling curve of the rising CO2 in the atmosphere, because our input in the atmosphere is much more than the output from the biosphere and from the oceans. In fact, the biosphere and the oceans are constantly transferring carbon between the surface and the atmosphere. We can see these big gray arrows here, that we have about 100 gigatons going into the oceans and the vegetation, the biosphere, every year, but also 100 are released, whether it's seasonal or changing in the temperatures, circulation patterns in the ocean. So we have a huge transfer and what we call a flux of carbon between the oceans and the biosphere continuously throughout the year. And then if we look on the side, we see that we've got arrows going only in one direction. And those are the contribution of the fossil fuels, about 10 units, and the contribution of changes in the vegetation, the changes in the rainforest, the deforestation. And this is maybe about a third of the contribution of the CO2 into the atmosphere that we're seeing constantly. So naturally we have these cycles, but we've now added extra sources to one side of the equation, and therefore we're seeing increases continuously in the atmosphere. And the biosphere, changes in land use and the changes in how much natural vegetation are playing a big role here, approximately contributing maybe 1 to 2 gigatons of carbon every year to the atmosphere, and again between 20 to 40% of the contribution relative to the fossil fuels.